Hi everyone and welcome back to the garden. I don't know about you, but we've had a lovely few days here. The sun's been shining, the sky's been blue, and it's been great to actually see the plants starting to grow rather than just staying alive through winter. In today's video, I want to focus on something that I know a lot of people are interested in at the minute, and that's how to design and plant a tropical border or even a full garden this year. Now, I will be focusing on more structural and permanent planting over the next few videos. I'll be looking at the right plants for sunny gardens, for shady gardens, and also for small gardens. But today's video, I want to talk more about how to design a mixed tropical border. So one with permanent plants, as well as a summer planting you'll be putting out over the next month or so, to hopefully create a real lush tropical paradise by the middle of summer. Now, I do appreciate that tropical and exotic gardening, they're very loose terms, and in reality there's a huge array of different planting styles, plant choices and overall effects that you can create that still come under those definitions. So rather than saying there's a right or a wrong way of doing it, there definitely isn't. I want to talk today about 10 basic pointers that you can use to create your tropical garden, whether you live in the south coast in Cornwall, you're lucky enough to live down there, or you're equally lucky but maybe in different ways to live up in Scotland. Whether your garden's small or large, hopefully there's some take-home points today that can really help you be more confident with your planting. Now, my first tip, and this might sound a bit boring at first, is to do some homework. And by that I mean, gather pictures of gardens, tropical planting that really inspires you. The kind of look that you want to recreate in your own garden. So you can either do it on your computer, get a folder, save them all to that. On your phone, create an album, add them to there. You can even use Pinterest if that's your kind of thing. And there's some great places to find images. Obviously you can use Google Images, but Facebook groups like Hardy Tropicals and UK Tropical Style Gardening, there's a load of amazing private gardens. When you see pictures on there, some of them are absolutely incredible. So what I'm saying is, save all those photos together, get them in one place, and when you've got time to think about it, just go through them. And rather than just generally looking and generally being inspired by them, actually look closer and try to analyse what it is about that garden that really speaks to you. So it might be something like the repetition of a certain colour throughout it, it might be quite a restrained colour scheme, or it could be as simple as one plant combination. So this plant works well with that one, you might not have considered it before, and even just a small take home like that can really improve your garden this year. There's nothing stopping you going on YouTube and saving stills of your favourite tropical gardens on there. Personally, I can't think of any channels to recommend off the top of my head, and the fact that I'm playing pictures of my old garden on here, purely coincidental for copyright reasons. I don't like using other people's pictures on my videos. But however you get your pictures, save them all to that one folder, and I'm not suggesting you should directly copy off a plant by plant to recreate that garden, but just get some general ideas. And sometimes it's easier to have an end result and to know what you're working towards, rather than just building up the pieces of the puzzle then trying to make them fit together. My next tip then is a more practical one, and it's get any hard landscaping or soil improvements done before you put your plants in the ground. Obviously it's not the end of the world if you've already started, but it's more of a practical consideration. And if you're new to my channel, this is basically what I'm having to do here. So we only moved in last August, so this year I'm having to put the summer planting in. I'm not having to, I'm enjoying the process mostly. But I'm putting the summer planting in for this year, so that's all the banana plants, the seed grown annuals. I'm also filling out areas with permanent planting, the palm trees, the bamboos, the structural evergreens that will stay in the garden for hopefully years. And then in addition to that, I'm putting in the hard landscaping. So it's definitely a game of juggling the various sort of factors around. But what I'm getting at with this tip is that if there's a job that you need to do that's easier, not having the plants in the way, it's worth just making a note of it and getting it sorted over the next month or so. So examples could be painting the fence behind the border. One thing that's really trendy at the minute is having black fences. It really makes the plants pop. I'm a big fan of it, and I might get them done here if I can stomach the job of painting all these fence panels. But if you want to do something like that, it's going to be so much easier without big grasses and ferns in the way. Likewise, we're only in mid-April, just after mid-April, so there's still time to dig some manure into your soil. And in reality, it's probably the best investment that you can do right now to improve the growth of your plants over summer. Any work that you do to the soil, it acts as basically a slow release fertiliser. So if you can dig that manure in now, it gives your plants nutrients all summer, as well as improving the structure of that soil so they can get the roots in easier. So all these kind of jobs, just make a quick list. I'm not saying you have to do anything, but it's definitely a consideration before you get on with your planting. My next tip then, and this is probably aimed at those of you who are newer to tropical gardening, basically make a list or gather the plants that you've already got for the border and just make a rough note, either mentally or on paper, of what plants fall into which category. So generally speaking, I group them in my head at least in terms of permanent plants. So these are plants like bamboos, trachycarpus palm trees, phormiums, tree ferns even. Any plants that you put into the ground that stay there all year round, they might need a bit of protection, but you don't dig them up into a polytunnel or bring them inside over winter. So that's one group. The next group of plants are what I loosely refer to as summer planting. So this can be plants you grow from seed, like ricinus, cannas. There can be plants that come from bulbs and tubers, again like cannas or some gingers. Really all the plants that you can't plant out until after the last frost and that either have to be dug up or brought into a shed, a greenhouse, polytunnel, even inside over winter. So there's two main groups of plants, and this is the way I generally think when it comes to planting. You've got the permanent plants and the summer plants. Just as an example then, let's look back at this picture of our old garden. And this is the border that I had planted up originally. On the left hand side, there's a Butea eriuspatha, which is a hardy feather palm, and that stayed outside all year round. On the right hand side, where it's more shaded and sheltered against that wall, I had a Schefflera, a Tetrapanax and a couple of tree ferns. Again, permanent planting that stayed outside all year round with varying levels of protection. And at the back of the border, you might be able to see it, but I had one Trachycarpus fortunei, I had some grasses, I used Miscanthus floridulus and giganteus, and then I also had an Arundo donax, which is a giant reed. So although those grasses and reeds die back in winter, you chop them back and come spring they grow up again, and throughout the course of May and early June they get to their full height, 6, 7, 8 feet tall. So although they die back, because I left them out all year, I class those as permanent planting. So what I'm getting at is, it's important to really look at either the plants you've got or the design you're putting together and work out which plants are permanent and which plants are summer planting. And the reasons for that I'll go through later in this video, but it's important from a practical point of view, so you know what needs what care, and also from a design point of view. Now the reason I say to break your planting up in terms of permanent or structural planting and then summer planting is more of a practical consideration. So it's easy to design, put together a border based entirely on visual appeal or buy whichever plants you think look good and plonk them into your garden. But I think it's also helpful to have, at least in the back of your mind, what sorts of winter protection those plants need and also care. And one of the big reasons for this is actually my next tip, which is group plants together based on their requirements. So looking back at that picture of the old garden, you might notice that all the structural permanent plants are in a kind of horseshoe shape, and this left quite a big area in the middle. Now this is something I've actually moved over to the new garden here. I've got the same sort of idea. So I've got a backdrop of permanent planting and then various borders, areas of bare soil left for summer planting. Now grouping these plants together, there's several different benefits. The first is you know that they all roughly need the same care. So generally speaking, all the summer tropical or jungle planting, by which I mean the ensetes, the Colocasias, ricinus, they've all got big leaves, they all grow quickly, and they actually need pretty much the same sort of care. Now when I talk about grouping plants together, I do this with permanent plants as well as summer plants. So looking at the example of our old house, I had a triangular border and the left hand side of it got full sun, full exposure, and the ground there had quite a lot of grit in it, so it was quite dry. The right hand side was shaded, quite sheltered, so it didn't see a lot of sun, and it was actually quite damp there. I don't know the exact reason for that, but the soil was always wetter at that end. Maybe it just didn't see as much sun. So I actually grouped the permanent planting to suit these conditions. Now on the left hand side, I had a small palm tree, I had an aloe, and I had quite a few other tough plants like phormiums that could take the full sun, take the exposure, and didn't need any additional water in summer. On the right hand side, the Schefflera of a Tetrapanax, the tree ferns, they're all plants that could thrive in the damper soil and again could cope with that shade really well. So I tried to group them together to make it easier to look after them and to get healthier plants without as much effort. Now when it comes to the summer planting, I still group plants together. So the ensetes, the Colocasias, ricinus, they're all big leaf plants and they have roughly the same care requirements. So they all need a lot of water, a lot of fertiliser in summer, they're like a good rich soil, and they all generally need digging up or cutting down at the end of the year. So by grouping them together, it's easy just to think in your head, I need to feed that area of ground, I need to water that area more, and at the end of the year, you know what you're doing to tidy it up and you can make sure you bring all the plants inside or into the greenhouse. I don't think the benefits of grouping plants together are purely practical. There's definitely some visual benefits as well, and this might just be my personal opinion, but I think plants like the bananas, the Colocasias, the Coleus and the cannas, they all work really well crammed in together. So you really create that lush jungle vibe where you can't see through from one side to the other. I think they're absolutely great for that. The leaves are soft so they're not going to damage each other. Whereas plants like some palm trees and agaves especially, yuccas like rostrata, I think the really tough and spiky plants deserve their own space, and they're better off in a more minimal setting with maybe some gravel around them, just so you can appreciate the form of each plant. And obviously they're spiky, so you don't really want them interacting with each other too much. Again, it's my own personal opinion, but if I was wanting to create a mixed garden, or a mixed border, of these hard plants as well as the softer plants, it's worth giving a bit of consideration to the different planting areas. And even with one single border, you can have an area that's more arid planting that maybe like fades into an area of more lush jungle planting. So I'm not saying there's a right or wrong way of doing it, but it's an important consideration, and I think if you group these plants together, it definitely makes your life easier. Now, I know what you're thinking. I've watched all this video and you haven't even got onto planting yet, George. Well, you'll have to be patient because I've got one more tip before we begin. And that is, it's really important, this one, consider the eventual height of the plants you're putting into the ground, both for tropical summer planting as well as the permanent planting. Now, I mentioned this in a previous video, but it really is crucial. So the permanent planting, you might put in plants like Colocasias, the palm trees. They will grow tall and they won't take a huge amount of time to get there. So you need to make sure you've got the vertical space. And whilst that plant might be, say, 1/2 metre tall now and fit in nicely with the summer plants, it's going to grow up over time, maybe around 1 foot of trunk every year. So it'll soon size up. Will it look out of place? Is there enough room for it? Will it block a window? They're all considerations that you have to give. When it comes to some of the big leaf plants then, so permanent plants like tetrapanax, and even summer plants like your Enseti bananas, ricinus that you grow from seed every year, although they may be growing or actively growing for 6 months of the year, the amount of growth they put in over summer is absolutely incredible. So it's something you definitely need to take into account. Now, at our old garden, when I first planted the border up, one of the mistakes I made, really I was a bit overexcited with the fact that I had this actual patch of ground I could plant into. I didn't have to grow plants in containers anymore, so I grew basically every seed that I wanted to grow for a few years. I grew plants like ricinus that grew really tall, and surprisingly I chose all the biggest varieties. So I prepared the soil, gave them plenty of water, and everything grew absolutely massive. All the plants fought with each other, they got really lanky and started to lean over the patio. The tetrapanax, they soon get big, and again they get really wide and started to lean over the patio. So it's a consideration that you need to give, even for the summer planting. A plant that you maybe start off small that's 1 foot tall in May, by the end of June, July, it's going to get bigger and bigger, and by August it can be maybe even 2 meters tall. So it's a consideration that you need to take into account. If that plant grows for the size that it should do, if we have a good summer, then what's the effect of that on the design of the border? Is it going to lean over and create problems over a patio or neighbouring path or something like that? And just have a think about it, and that might lead you to make a few changes, maybe put some of the ricinus at the back. So even though they might look small when you plant them out, you need to think about what the eventual size will be and how that garden's going to look in a couple of months' time. Finally, we're on to planting out, and if you think it's taken a while to get to this point, then you've not been filming this video in a garden with trains passing every 10 minutes or so and dogs barking at each other in neighbouring gardens. Max is inside today, so at least it's not him. But anyway, we're on to planting at last, and the first thing that I would recommend is to get your permanent plants in first. The structural plants, the evergreens, those that stay out all year. Now obviously at this time of year, that's probably a fairly obvious practical consideration because it's still April, there's frost forecasts over the next week, and depending on where you live in the country, it can be early to mid-May before you plant out your summer tropical plants. You have to wait until the last frost has been forecast. Now I have done a full video looking at the best time to plant your tropical plants out, but even if you're watching this video in mid to late May, June and onwards, I would still recommend putting the permanent structural plants, your palm trees, the phormiums, the bamboos in first. And I think really just slowing it down and doing this step first, it lets you think about how big those plants are going to get and the right position for them. Now these structural permanent plants are going to be the plants that you look at for most of the year. So whilst your tropical plants go out in May, it can often take a month or so for them really to start to fill out. So realistically, you might only have from June to October with your full tropical garden. The rest of the year, you've got these palms, the bamboos, the tree ferns maybe, to bring evergreen interest. So they are an important factor. You need to give them the space that they deserve because they're not as easily moved as a banana plant is. So one thing that I would recommend is prioritising where they go in the garden. Really slow the process down, just look at the permanent plants. Now, once you've got your permanent plants set out, I wouldn't rush to actually put them straight into the soil. Just have a look at how the border's going to look and try to imagine it in your head how those plants are going to grow and develop over the next 5 to 10 years. So that Trachycarpus that's ½ metre tall, it'll grow up and it'll probably be 6, 7, 8 feet tall in that time. And the grasses will fill out and get bigger. Bamboos will form a decent clump in that time. So it's important to really have an idea of where the garden's going to go. And the next thing that I would look at before you put them into the ground is the height of the border. So obviously the traditional way is have small plants at the front, have your bedding at the front, and maybe build up through the mid-level plants like the Colocasias, the bananas, right up to the peak of the border at the back, where you've got your giant grasses, maybe your ricinus, bamboos. That's the way that I personally use for most of the garden. There's nothing stopping you having taller plants at the front, especially plants that you can see past or through. You can completely mix it up, but it's worth giving it some thought. Rather than just plonk the plants where you think they look good now, just try to get that idea of the eventual height and plan out your border to some kind of design or rhythm. Once you've got your permanent plants roughly placed out, you like the idea of how they're going to eventually develop, you've created either a triangle effect or maybe a garden that drops down from tall plants to small. However you want to do it, just give it some consideration. It's now time to get onto the tropical planting. Again, like I said, I'd probably wait until the middle of May for this. You might get away with early May depending on where you live, maybe even the back end of April, but those are real exceptions, maybe in the middle of London. For most of the UK, and especially seeing as the way that this year's going, we've had the coldest April for a lot of years, it could easily be middle of May. So when it's time to put your tropical plants outside, again, give some consideration to the height, but the main thing that I would say here is spacing. Now, again, I've already said, consider the eventual size of these plants, and you really need to give that some thought as you're putting them out. But spacing's different to eventual height, because obviously you can cram these tropical plants in closer if that's the look you want to create. And when it comes to the actual ideal spacing, obviously there's no perfect, there's no sort of thing you have to aim for, but I generally like to get to a point where you can't see much soil by the middle of the season, so that's the back end of July, which does mean that you have to be patient and trust in these plants' growth, because when you plant them out in May, there will be soil between them. They might look a bit daft. Your ricinus plants might only be 6 inches to a foot tall at that point. You do have to be patient, and what you will see in your own garden, or maybe other people commenting on Facebook, is that your tropical plants that you've put into the ground early to middle of May, they will start growing very slowly, and it might take them a good few weeks to actually get going, probably well into June. Now, there's a few reasons for this. The soil's still cold at that point, so the weather might be warm, the days might actually start to feel properly warm, hopefully by then, but the soil always lags behind the air temperature. It's more the back end of the year when that soil really has the warmth. So you've put your plants that have been grown in greenhouses, maybe inside on your windowsill, in optimal conditions. You plant them straight into soil that's a bit colder than they'd like. So they will take a while to settle in, they might be set back a bit, but trust me, they will get going eventually. And the other thing is hardening off. Whilst everyone should harden off the plants properly, so you gradually increase your exposure to the sunlight, the elements outside, not everyone does it, and not everyone does it enough. So your plants are going to have a bit of shock just from being in this sun. Maybe the wind might set them back and snap a few leaves off. So be patient, but absolutely trust me that when they do get going, these plants will get going really fast. For me, July is when the magic happens and your tropical plants really take off. So you plant them out in May, and they take a while to actually get used to the conditions, to start to put the roots down and to actually eventually grow. June, you're obviously watching every plant, and when you watch the plant, it just doesn't grow, so everything seems to grow really slowly. But July is when it's more consistently warm and everything really takes off. You just go away for a weekend, or you stop watching the garden for a week, you come back and it's absolutely incredible. All the plants have maybe doubled in size, and it's just so incredible how fast these plants can grow. One thing I'm especially looking forward to this year are those thunderstorms you have in July and August, when it's really hot, the plants are growing at full speed, and then you get a massive downpour, massive humidity, and the plants just put on so much growth over the next few days. It's absolutely incredible. So What I'm saying is, without being too boring and prescriptive about your garden, you don't want to leave too much space around each plant, but equally be ready for that big growth and have an idea of how big these plants will get in a few months. So that might mean leaving a bit of bare soil around each plant in May when you're first planting out, but just trust that they will get big and they will get there sooner than you think. Now, you can use bedding plants or plants like nasturtiums to fill in the gaps when you first put out your summer planting. But personally, I know that it only takes a month, 6 weeks for your plants to start to knit together, to start to fill out. And I can guarantee, especially if it's your first tropical garden or border, that by early August, you'll think, I put too many plants in there. It's going to happen, and you'll have a garden just like ours a few years ago. So I think it's worth just putting up with a bit of space, but have trust, have faith that these plants will grow over summer. So by this point then, you've planted out the permanent plants, the structural plants that will develop year after year to help create stunning tropical centerpiece in your garden. You put your tropical plants outside, you've given them enough space to develop, but maybe still try to get that packed look, that jungle look that you really want in. So you might think at this point, the garden's missing a little something. It needs something to tie it together, and why doesn't it look like those picture tropical gardens that I really want it to? And for me, the secret key at this point are bedding plants. Personally, I use Coleus. Now, there's so many different varieties available. My favourite is China Rose. It's a lovely sort of light pink on a dark purple, a really bright, vivid colour. And one thing that I would recommend, I also mentioned this tip in my design video, but use the same variety throughout the garden. So you can use it at the front of the border, around focal plants, even in pots as well. You can use the same variety, and it really helps tie the garden together. So you might have a mishmash of different cannas, banana plants, palm trees, maybe even phormiums, you know, every kind of plant has got a different structure, a different colour, and it can sometimes look like a collection of plants rather than a cohesive garden. But by just using one kind of bedding plant, if you don't want a bedding plant and you want something more permanent, then heucheras are a good choice. There's so many zingy colours and they're fine outside all year. But for me, Coleus are the stars of the show. They absolutely tie the garden together. And like I say, you can use them at the front of borders, you can use them around plants, you can use them in pots, and it really helps tie your garden together. My final tip is just to be brave, be confident, be experimental, and really go for it with your summer tropical planting this year. Even if you don't have a huge amount of gardening experience or you're fairly new to these plants, have a go at the garden that you think would look good. Because the main thing with these tropical plants is that you can have another go at it next year. So you dig most of them up in October, or in the case of annuals, they go straight on the compost heap or chopped up onto your garden. And that space is ready, it's clear, and you've got all winter to look at even more ideas and YouTube videos for inspiration to put together a more improved garden next year. And the other thing is really a lot of these plants, these exotic tropical plants like the bananas, the tetrapanax, ricinus, to most people who don't know a lot about tropical gardening, they're very impressive in their own right anyway. So whilst the garden might quite not develop into the garden that you've got in your head, to 95% of people, maybe even 99% of people, it will look absolutely incredible. So that's probably the final point. Just create the garden that you want to do. Any mistakes that you make, you'll learn from them. And I'm by no means saying that I'm a fully competent expert garden designer. I've just learned from my mistakes over the years. And even in this new garden here, we're basically starting again. So whilst I'm going to incorporate some of the things that I know have worked well, really, again, I'm rolling the dice and trying new things, trying new designs and new plant combinations to hopefully land on something that looks even more impressive. So thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video and maybe picked up a few helpful tips, especially if you're looking to put your first tropical garden or border together this summer. It's an exciting time and I wish you all the best with it. If you need any more information on the plants or maybe tips that I mentioned, just leave a comment below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. See you soon.